In 1837, terrifying tales of a devil-like gentleman or leaping man began to spring up in the villages around London. The frightening figure appeared to have an unnatural appearance and equally inexplicable abilities. Soon his antics spread to London itself, and the press coined a name for him: Springheeled Jack. Manifestations of Springheeled Jack slowly spread from London around the country. They continued until 1904, after which this semi-mythical figure mysteriously disappeared. However, Jack remained very much a part of the popular imagination, appearing in fictional stories, plays, and later films, even lending his name to an infamous murderer, all because of the terror his story generated. Here are just 16 details that illustrated precisely how and why the story of Springheeled Jack was so frightening. Number 16. Women appeared to have been the particular prey of Springheeled Jack. Springheeled Jack is rumored to have first appeared on the outskirts of London in October 1837. In 1928, Elizabeth Villiers told the tale of a servant girl, Mary Stevens. Mary was returning to her post in a house in Lavender Hill after a visit to her parents in Battersea. She was walking alone over Clapham Common when a strange figure leapt at her out of a dark alley. Gripping her tightly in his arms, her assailant began to kiss her face and ripped her clothes. Fortunately, Mary's screams brought help, and her attacker fled. However, it was in February 1838 that Jack hit the headlines when he began to attack the middle classes. Outrage on a young lady screamed the Times on February 11th. The paper carried the story of 18-year-old gentleman's daughter Jane Alsop, who had been attacked 2 days earlier near her home between the villages of Bow and Old Ford. Jane's attacker caught her by the neck and clothing, forced her head under his arm and tore her dress and hair before she managed to escape and run for her home, where her screams eventually raised help from the household. By March, Springheeled Jack had moved into London itself. The Morning Post reported the story of his next victim on March 7, 1838. On February 28, 18-year-old Lucy Scales was walking home with her sister after visiting her brother in the Limehouse area of East London. Part of their journey home took them down a passage called Green Dragon Alley. Lucy was in the lead when she noticed a figure lurking in the shadows. Before she could retrace her steps, the figure sprang and attacked her with a quantity of blue flame that left her unconscious. Meanwhile, her sister's screams alerted their brother, and the attacker fled into the night. The next day, the mysterious attacker struck again, this time causing a carriage to crash and injuring the coachman. Several witnesses said they saw the man escape by leaping over a 9-foot wall, laughing manically as he did so. On the whole, however, Springheeled Jack stuck to terrorizing women. In October 1837, he assaulted a Blackheath barmaid named Polly Adams at a local fair. Polly reported how her attacker tore off her blouse and scratched her stomach with his claws before escaping over a fence. Number 15. Springheeled Jack had a forbidding appearance. Some people even said he looked like the devil. The descriptions of all these early appearances of Springheeled Jack all had the same chilling aspects in common. The women all described him as having claws that he used to tear their clothing and rake their skin. The barmaid Polly Adams described these claws as being cold and clammy on her skin, while Jane Alsop stated she was sure the nails that scratched her clothing were of some metallic substance. The women also described their assailant as heavily cloaked when they first encountered him, with his head covered by a helmet or bonnet. In fact, at first glance, Lucy Scales had thought the mysterious figure in Green Dragon Alley might have been a woman from the appearance of his headgear. However, at some point in the proceedings, this cloak or helmet was removed to reveal that the mysterious attacker had a devil-like appearance. Jane Alsop described how, once he had thrown his cloak back, she noticed Springheeled Jack had a most hideous and frightful appearance and eyes like red balls of fire. Lucy Alsop's sister described Lucy's assailant as tall and thin and looking like a gentleman. However, Springheeled Jack also possessed another strange, but very particular feature. Jane Alsop described her attacker as wearing a tight-fitting white oilskin garment, This garment was linked to another aspect of Springheeled Jack's appearance: fire. Both Lucy Scales and Jane Alsop referred to Springheeled Jack either carrying a lantern or asking for some light. This need for light had nothing to do with enhancing Springheeled Jack's unnerving appearance, but everything to do with one of his peculiar abilities. Number 14. Springheeled Jack had strange abilities that were seen to be of either supernatural or scientific origin. Springheeled Jack was supposedly incredibly quick on his feet, allowing him to flee the scene of his crimes without a trace. However, his primary skill was his ability to leap into the air to an improbable height. One of the first descriptions of this ability came in the aftermath of the initial attacks in 1837, when a businessman reported seeing a leaping man on Barnes Common. Witnesses credited Jack with the ability to leap over obstacles between 6 and 20 feet in height. After Jane Alsop's attack, he was said to have leapt straight into the air and disappeared. As a result, many people took this as proof that Springheeled Jack had a supernatural origin. However, Springheeled Jack left proof of a more earthly explanation. In the aftermath of the Mary Stevens attack on Clapham Common, investigators discovered 3-inch deep footprints near Clapham Church, each bearing the marks of a spring. This discovery was followed on December 30 by descriptions by the residents of Lewisham of a figure wearing a bear skin and sprung shoes that allowed him to jump to and fro before foot passengers. However, the ability to jump to great heights was not Springheeled Jack's only alarming ability. For both Lucy Scales and Jane Alsop said that their attacker was able to conjure forth flames from nowhere. Jane Alsop described how her attacker vomited forth a quantity of blue and white flames from his mouth, while Lucy Scales described how hers spurted a quantity of blue flame into her face. As a result, Lucy fell to the floor, unable to see and terrified. During the aftermath of her attack, Lucy Scales suffered from violent fits. The Morning Post reported that the police believed Miss Scales' indisposition was caused by her assailant blowing through a tube in which spirits of wine, sulfur, and another ingredient were deposited and ignited. However, not everyone was so sure that science was the key. Number 13. Part of the terror of Springheeled Jack was he made people feel unsafe in their own homes. Jane Alsop's story is the earliest clear, contemporary description of one of Springheeled Jack's attacks. The violence of the attack was bad enough. However, what made it worse was the fact that Jane's assailant had explicitly selected her and lured her out of her own home rather than attacking her on the street. Jane had been inside the house when she heard the violent ringing of the house bell. When she went to find out what the commotion was about, she heard a man she thought was a policeman tell her to bring me a light. We have caught Springheeled Jack here in the lane. It was only once Jane opened the door that her assailant attacked her. Even when Jane was back in the house, having been rescued by her elder sister, Mrs. Susan Harrison, Jack persisted in terrorizing the women by knocking on the door until they managed to call out for the police. If the Alsop case had been an isolated instance, people might have been less concerned. However, later in the month, another home was targeted. One day in late February 1838, there was a knock at the door of the house of a Mr. Ashworth of 2 Turner Street, Commercial Road. Before answering the door, the servant boy looked out and observed that the unexpected visitor had a most hideous appearance. It was so bad that the boy screamed for help and the mystery caller ran away. Springheeled Jack might have been easy enough to drive away if a householder had company. However, for those alone, the prospect of a visitation by a hideous, fire-breathing villain must have been an uneasy prospect. Number 12. Springheeled Jack's motive seems to have been to cause fear. The motivation behind Springheeled Jack's attacks was perplexing. For although the attacks were undoubtedly vicious, neither were they rape or robberies. On the whole, society classed Jack's attacks as pranks and outrages. However, they were jokes that caused a great deal of distress to the victims. In January 1838, just before the attacks on Alsop and Scales, Sir John Cowan, the Mayor of London, revealed the contents of an anonymous letter he had received to a public meeting in the Mansion House. The letter, simply signed a resident of Peckham, revealed amongst other things, that Springheeled Jack's activities had resulted in at least 7 ladies losing of their senses. 2 were unlikely to recover. 1 maidservant answering the door had been sent into a fatal swoon by Jack's frightening appearance. There were numerous similar accounts in the newspapers. Reporters undoubtedly exaggerated some of the details for effect. However, Springheeled Jack's attacks did cause genuine trauma. For the cases of Lucy Scales and Jane Alsop were thoroughly investigated and documented by the police. These accounts show that terror and intimidation rather than physical harm were on Jack's agenda. Jack's attacks were undoubtedly vicious. He held Lucy Alsop in a headlock and tore out her hair. He also breathed fire at both women and scratched their flesh and tore their clothing. This violence was not designed to cause lasting physical damage. It would, however, have caused immediate, observable terror. To cause and enjoy the palpable fear of his victims seems to have been Springheeled Jack's primary aim. It was for this reason he stayed outside Lucy Alsop's home after her rescue, to watch the women of the house panic over his presence. According to one report, the wager according to which Spring John plays his pranks runs that he is to kill 6 females with fright. And there was the aftermath of his attacks. For through the newspapers Jack would have learned that Lucy Scales was left suffering from hysterics and great agitation, in all probability the result of fright. These newspaper stories allowed Springheeled Jack himself to enjoy the lasting effects of his outrages long after he had left the scene of the crime. Number 11. Such was the fear of Springheeled Jack that Napoleonic heroes organized special patrols and took to the streets to hunt him. The public, faced by the prospect of being frightened senseless by a leaping maniac from which not even bricks and mortar could protect them, were undoubtedly alarmed. Pressure grew on the authorities to do something, especially when the attacks reached the city of London itself, and began to threaten the affluent classes. The Lord Mayor of London, after initially believing that newspaper accounts had made the greatest exaggerations regarding Springheeled Jack's activities, changed his mind and decided the matter needed serious attention. The police were instructed to hunt down Springheeled Jack. Special patrols were organized to roam the streets. One of the organizers of these vigilante groups was reputed to be the Duke of Wellington. Now aged 70, the victor of Waterloo had supposedly taken to horseback armed with his pistols to hunt down the vicious nuisance. The Duke's private papers, however, do not substantiate his involvement in any search for Springheeled Jack. But another Napoleonic hero is known to have involved himself in the hunt for Springheeled Jack. Admiral Edward Codrington, who fought in the Battle of Trafalgar and the Battle of Navarino, did not take to the streets himself. However, he did offer a reward for Springheeled Jack's capture. Number 10. Some people believed Springheeled Jack was, in fact, a group of aristocratic tricksters. However, the matter of Springheeled Jack was complicated because no one was certain if they were looking for one man or a whole group. Some witnesses claimed that Springheeled Jack had an accomplice who helped him. After Jane Alsop's attack, Springheeled Jack reputedly dropped his cloak in the lane and left it behind as he fled the police. However, when the officers went to investigate, the garment had disappeared, leading them to suspect someone had retrieved it for him. Others, however, believed the attacks were the work of a group rather than one individual. On Sunday, February 25, the Morning Herald described the attack on Mr. Ashworth at Commercial Road as being perpetrated by one of the Springheeled Jack gang. Despite being frightened, the servant boy who observed the visitor noted a family crest adorned the visitor's cloak. This exclusive motif lent credence to a growing theory that the gang were aristocrats, getting their kicks from frightening the ordinary people of London. The letter to the Lord Mayor of London had started this belief in aristocratic involvement when its author, the mysterious resident of Peckham, described how the attacks began as the result of a wager laid by individuals from the highest ranks of life. However, the letter did not suggest those who laid the wager were directly involved in their attacks, only a mischievous and foolhardy companion. Rumors began to spread about the identity of that individual. Number 9. Others believed that Springheeled Jack was the Marquess of Waterford. The idea that Springheeled Jack was an aristocrat began to grow out of the earliest reports of his crimes. Lucy Scales and her sister described how he had the demeanor of a gentleman. However, even before Lucy's attack, reports were coming in that substantiated the assertion of the letter received by the Mayor of London that Springheeled Jack was an aristocrat. The Times, on January 10, 1838, reported how a Thomas Lott of Bow Street had reported some individual gentleman who drives about with a livery servant in a cab and throwing off a cloak, appears in these frightful forms and is to win a wager by the joke. Early Victorian London had the perfect candidate for an aristocratic Springheeled Jack, Henry Beresford, the third Marquess of Waterford. An Irish nobleman, Waterford was considered eccentric at best. In the 1830s he had a reputation for drunken brawling, vandalism and rather unpleasant jokes. In 1880 E. Cobham Brewer, the original author of Brewer's Dictionary of Phrase and Fables, noted how the Marquess liked to amuse himself by springing on travellers unawares, to frighten them. These unrestrained and erratic behaviors earned Waterford the epithet the Mad Marquess. His persona fitted that of Springheeled Jack to a T. He was just the sort of person to be roaming about in disguise, playing frightening tricks upon people, especially women, for whom he reputedly had nothing but contempt. However, although he was wild, the Mad Marquess was never vicious. All that linked Waterford to Springheeled Jack was his reputation. However, the evidence suggested they could not be the same person. For when Jack was carrying out attacks in April 1837, the Marquess was being tried at the Derby Assizes for an assault at Croxton Park races. Number 8. The authorities never convicted anyone for the crimes of Springheeled Jack. Perhaps the most frightening aspect of the case of Springheeled Jack for the populace of London was that the courts never convicted anyone for his crimes. That is not to say that there was any shortage of suspects. Shortly after the Jane Alsop incident, a man called Thomas Milbank was tried at Lambeth Street Court for her assault. For Milbank had been overheard boasting in a local pub, De Morgan Arms, that he was Springheeled Jack. The arresting officer, James Lee, who had also arrested the Red Barn murderer, was sure he had the right man. When Lee arrested him, Milbank was wearing white overalls similar to those worn by Jane Alsop's attacker. Investigations uncovered a discarded greatcoat and candle nearby. However, Milbank escaped conviction because Jane Alsop insisted that her attacker had breathed fire out of her mouth, and Thomas Milbank admitted he could do no such thing. Another potential suspect was Charles Grenville, whose case was reported by the Examiner newspaper. Grenville's appearance certainly fit the bill. The Examiner described him as a tall, ill-favored young man who fitted descriptions of Springheeled Jack: gangly, unusual appearance. Grenville was caught after frightening a number of women and children with behaviors similar to the silly and dangerous pranks of Springheeled Jack. However, no one seriously believed Grenville could be Springheeled Jack, for the young man was too simple-minded to have orchestrated his crimes undetected across London. Number 7. Springheeled Jack began to appear all over the British Isles. Whoever he was, Springheeled Jack did not restrict himself to London. Soon he was spreading north, passing up through the Midlands into the north of England, even Scotland. One of Jack's most notable non-London appearances was to a group of soldiers at Aldershot Barracks in Hampshire. One night in August 1877, a sentry was on guard duty in the North Camp when he observed a most peculiar figure advancing towards him out of the darkness. The soldier challenged the mysterious individual and ordered them to halt and identify themselves. The person did no such thing. Instead, they audaciously approached the soldier and slapped him about the face. Once he had recovered, the startled soldier fired warning shots at his assailant. Unharmed and with astonishing bounds, the audacious prankster disappeared once again into the darkness. Sightings of Springheeled Jack were especially prevalent in the Midlands of England, especially the area around the industrial Black Country between 1855 and the 1880s. One of Jack's earliest sightings in the region was in Sandwell, near Dudley. Jack was seen leaping from the roof of the cross and onto that of a neighboring butcher's shop. However, when he was not leaping about the rooftops, Springheeled Jack continued to terrorize young women. In September 1886, the Birmingham Post reported how a young girl suddenly felt a hand on her shoulder. When she turned around, she was terrified to find herself face to face with the infernal one with a glowing face, who bid her a good evening. Springheeled Jack's last reported sighting was in Everton and Liverpool in 1904. He was seen leaping up and down the streets before jumping onto the rooftops and bounding away, never to be seen again. However, it was not just the fact that the phenomenon of Springheeled Jack was spreading countrywide that was alarming, but the time frame over which he continued to appear. For Jack materialized in various places at various times over a 70-year period. During this time, Springheeled Jack never aged, continuing to manifest as a young man, agile man. There were various explanations for this. Number 6. Springheeled Jack may have kept on manifesting over a 70-year period because he spawned a series of copycats. The first explanation for the continued manifestation of Springheeled Jack was the alarming possibility that the original had inspired a new generation of copycats. In November 1872, Peckham was left in a state of commotion due to the appearance of a Springheeled Jack wannabe known as the Peckham Ghost. The News of the World described this new urban terror as Springheeled Jack, who terrified a past generation. Some people may well have been taken in by this sensationalist headline and believed that Jack was back in London. However, many other people were cynical. One of those cynics was the writer and artist Beatrix Potter. On March 1, 1877, Potter noted that there has been a most singular nuisance going on since Christmas around Manchester. A gang of young men calling themselves Springheeled Jacks have been going about in the dusk and frightening people. They wore india-rubber dresses which would puff up at will to a great size, horns, a lantern and springs in their boots. These counterfeit jacks terrorized both men and young women and stole to boot the one factor that differentiated them from their early Victorian inspiration. Number 5. However, many people believe Springheeled Jack was of supernatural origin. However, other people believe the original Springheeled Jack had never gone away because he was no mere mortal. Right from the first moment Jack had sprung into the public eye, many of the general public believed he was a supernatural entity. The Morning Chronicle of 1838 described how the residents of Peckham believed they were being plagued not by a man but by the pranks of the ghost, imp, or devil. In these accounts, Springheeled Jack took on the shape of a white bull or bear and would prey upon helpless women and children or anyone who went out at night without a lantern or a stout stick. People credited Springheeled Jack with a supernatural origin because, despite advances in science and technology, many people in late Georgian and early Victorian England still had one foot in the superstitious past. In the early years of the 19th century, some even believed that malignant spirits roamed the streets of London. Not content with lurking in the shadows, these specters were thought to actively terrifying passers-by. Some of the ghosts simply frightened their victims by stalking them through the fog and poorly lit streets as they walked alone by night. Others, however, actually attacked them. In 1826, a figure known as the Southampton Ghost was reputed to have assaulted its victims. Described as being masked, wearing steel armor and able to jump over 10-feet walls, the ghost bore many of the characteristics later attributed to Springheeled Jack. Number 4. Other people thought that Springheeled Jack was a madman, or an alien. The crimes committed by Springheeled Jack were so bizarre that many people believed the perpetrator, or some of the imitators, at least were insane. Many years after Jack made his final appearance on the rooftops of Liverpool, another version of this particular appearance of Springheeled Jack emerged. In this version, Jack was not merely leaping from roof to roof and showing off to passers-by. Instead, he was a mentally ill man fleeing the police. The 1967 newspaper article explained that the individual in question was a man suffering from religious mania. As he leapt across the rooftops, he was supposed to have been heard to cry, "My wife is the devil." This story may have been 20th century society's attempt to retrospectively lend the concept of Springheeled Jack a more rational explanation. How accurate it is of the multitude of Jacks who sprang up over the years is debatable. Another, less rational 20th century explanation of Springheeled Jack is that he was neither a human or supernatural being but a creature from another world. From the 1950s onwards, theorists have suggested that Springheeled Jack could have been a humanoid alien, stranded on Earth, therefore offering an explanation for his odd clothes, features, abilities, and the fact he kept appearing over a long period. It is significant that a high proportion of those who saw him was convinced that he was not of this world, but either a spirit or a visitor from some distant planet, said British radio presenter Valentine Dyall in Everyman magazine in 1954. This article prompted a response from Inman Race of Sheffield, who suggested that Jack's alien origins explained why he could jump so high. A being reared on a planet where gravity was far greater than on Earth would be able to leap colossal distances on this planet, he maintained. Number 3. Springheeled Jack gave his name to Jack the Ripper. Although violent, Springheeled Jack never inflicted physical injuries upon his victims that would have killed them. However, that did not stop locals in the poorer areas of London from associating him with violent crimes. In the 1860s, Jack became tenuously associated with the murder of Maria Davis, a prostitute from the slums of Jacob Island in Bermondsey. One of Maria's clients reputedly killed her by pushing her over a bridge into an open sewer called Folly's Ditch. Although the coroner recorded a verdict of death by misadventure and Maria's death was quite unlike any of Springheeled Jack's normal attacks, the locals maintained he was the culprit. This association between Springheeled Jack and attacks on women lingered. In the late 1880s, the Whitechapel murders began. As with the Maria Davis case, the only thing the Ripper murders had in common with the activities of Springheeled Jack was that the victims were women. For Jack may have roughed his victims up and ripped their clothes. However, the physical injuries he inflicted never went beyond a few scratches. However, in the popular mind, Springheeled Jack immediately became associated with the attacks. In fact, the murderer or someone pretending to be him even began to use his name. One of the earliest letters sent to the Metropolitan Police, supposedly from the Ripper himself, was signed Springheeled Jack, the Whitechapel murderer. Soon, the anonymous letter writer was signing himself just Jack. This new terror of London traded on not only the name but the reputation of Springheeled Jack. And so, Jack the Ripper was born. Number 2. Springheeled Jack became the new bogeyman of Victorian society. The Ripper murders were just one example of how Springheeled Jack had become Victorian society's new bogeyman. Parents began to use the threat of Springheeled Jack to scare their children into submission. However, the danger of a brush with Springheeled Jack was not just used against children. In the Black Country, local preachers used Springheeled Jack as a warning against the perils of getting drunk or drinking at all. It was not just the temperance movement that employed Springheeled Jack, for he also became a crucial player in Victorian morality tales. One such story appeared in Franklin's Miscellany in 1838. In the Spring Jack written by a Peter Piper, Springheeled Jack visits a pub in Peckham Rye where his devilish antics force the landlord to mend his ways. After Springheeled Jack melts his pots and burns his provisions, the landlord begins to punctually attend the neighboring church. He also ensures that he stops cheating his customers by making sure he filled his pots and given good measure. In short, Springheeled Jack's story captured the popular imagination. Henry Mayhew in his Labour and the London Poor shows the character of the devil in Punch and Judy shows was renamed Springheeled Jack. Jack also became the villainous subject of several plays. The perfect embodiments of this were the popular penny dreadfuls, cheap magazines of sensationalist stories. Here, Springheeled Jack was portrayed either as an object of horror or a kind of Victorian superhero. Number 1. Ultimately, Springheeled Jack had his roots in the past and grew as a reaction to social change. The fear surrounding the phenomenon of Springheeled Jack was the result of a conflict between progress and tradition. On the one hand, the Victorian age was an era of technological development. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing and humanity was more in control of its environment than ever before. These changes were accompanied by a vast shift of the majority of the population from country to town. Many of these urban migrants still believed in the power of the supernatural. So they brought their rural superstitions went with them. The character and name of Springheeled Jack found his echo in many ancient mischief-making figures of rural British culture. Jack in the Green, another name for Puck or the Green Man, was an anti-hero or mischief maker who accompanied the May Queen in May Day processions. Another was Jack O'Kent, a figure from the Welsh borders who made a pact with the devil. Mischief-making aside, Springheeled Jack's speed can be attributed to another legendary character, Jack Robinson. The Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue of 1811 described this character as a very volatile gentleman, who would call on his neighbors and be gone before his name could be announced.